continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from Civil War battlefields to Antarctic exploration to historic preservation and so much more. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Paul Scanlon, who is Professor Emeritus of Medicine in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota. He trained at the University of Minnesota, Mayo Medical School, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard. He served as Medical Director of the Mayo Clinic Pulmonary Function Laboratories, the busiest such laboratory in North America, for 30 years. He is the founding Medical Director of the Mayo Clinic Pulmonary Clinical Research Unit. He was the Medical Director of the Mayo Clinic Dolores Jean Lavin Center for Humanities and Medicine. He is author or co-author of over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles, as well as book chapters and editorials, and a popular book on pulmonary function interpretation. He is the senior author of the original descriptions of the, quote, non-specific pattern and the complex restrictive pattern, which were previously unrecognized, and together account for 15% of all complete pulmonary function tests. He was a practicing clinician in pulmonary and critical care medicine and active in clinical trials of therapies for COPD and asthma, as well as pulmonary physiology and new developments in pulmonary function testing. He served as a consultant for important environmental issues, including asbestos hazards in Libby, Montana, and the Minnesota Taconite Workers' Health Study of asbestos-related diseases. He taught regularly in the medical school, in the ICU, in the clinic, and in the pulmonary function laboratory. He retired from clinical practice on November 13th, 2019. He is the author of Rochester Stories, a Med City History, which we're here to learn about tonight. Paul?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Microphone working? Okay. My voice is very soft, so I'll try to speak up. But if you're having difficulty hearing me, please let me know. So welcome. It's nice to see a good crowd here tonight, and I hope I can keep you entertained and awake for an hour or so. Obviously, we're here to talk a little bit about my book. The book came out this past June, and it's been fairly popular among people that I'm hearing from, and I'm pleased with how it's going. But we'll talk a little bit about what prompted the book. Just by way of disclosure, I do receive royalties from the book. You're supposed to get disclosures about financial conflict of interest. That's a pretty obvious one. And you don't necessarily have to buy the book. It's available for loan from the public library. And people have had the excellent idea of shouldn't they have a Kindle version or Kindle version or ebooks or audiobooks. Unfortunately, my publisher doesn't do those, so we don't have a ready way of doing that, but it's a good idea. So yeah, I'll try and speak up. So you heard my lengthy intro. It's kind of embarrassing to listen to all of that, but I've lived here in Rochester. I was born in Rochester and grew up here. And as a result of growing up here, I have a lengthier perspective on the history of Rochester than somebody my age might otherwise have. So I've lived here all but 9 years of my life, 3 years each for college, residency, and fellowship. And otherwise, I've lived here pretty much my whole life. I worked at the clinic for 35 years, actually a number of years before I joined the staff, but 35 years on the staff of the clinic. And you heard about some of the things that I did when I was on the staff. And I've served in a number of boards in Rochester. I've been involved in the school board, the Montessori board, the Art Center board, the Civic Music board, and was recently asked to join the History Center board. And I do have a number of activities that I enjoy, including history and architecture and collecting books and postcards. So a number of things that intersect and provide me interest in the history of Rochester. As I said, I was born here in Rochester, born at St. Mary's. For those of you that know anything about Mayo Clinic, the medical records there, every patient, can you? Sure.
What's that?
I don't know. Let's see. Does it sound better?
Where are we on volume?
I'll try and speak up. So the medical records, every patient at Mayo has a unique medical record number that started with 0. And they're currently in around 13 million. So my history begins with a 1, which is mostly octogenarians and older. As I said, I've lived here in Rochester for most of my life. I do have quite a bit of interest in history, but my own history dates all the way back to the Centrifuge of Medical Sciences, which is a historical artifact of some renown. And among the current staff of Mayo Clinic, the Rochester natives are relatively uncommon. So I get asked a lot of questions about the history of Rochester. And as I went through my career, I frequently thought I should write down some of these stories. There's a lot of good stories about Mayo Clinic and about Rochester. And so I set that as sort of a goal for retirement. I retired 2 years ago and decided to start writing some of these stories. So that was what generated the book. Question number 1 that comes up all the time, which is the ending of my book, is why did they build the Mayo Clinic out here in the middle of, some would say middle of nowhere, some would say in the middle of the cornfields, but out here in the Midwest and not a very populous city. This is by far the most commonly asked question about Mayo and about Rochester. And that's the ending of my book, which I'll leave towards for all of you to read. There are a lot of other commonly asked questions. Where did the name Zumbro come from? A lot of people think that's a Native American name, which it's not. And it's not something I'm going to cover tonight, but it's an interesting story behind the origins of that name, which is in the book. What happened to local Indians? I'll talk a little bit about that. Tell me about the tornadoes. There was more than one. Spelling of Olmsted, and where's the name Olmsted come from? What about the geese and the falcons and the subway? Where's the train? So there are a lot of questions like that that come up frequently. There are a number of previous histories that have been written, histories of Mayo, of Olmsted, Mayo Clinic, of Olmsted County, and of Rochester. And there are some of these that are pretty good references. There were 3 general histories of Olmsted County, which were written quite a long time ago. The first was published in 1866 when the county was only 12 years old. Olmsted County was founded in 1855. It was 11 years old at the time. So imagine writing the history of something that's only 11 years old. It's a pretty small book. The next history was published in 1883 by a guy named Samuel Eaton. And then there was a history in 1910 by Joseph A. Leonard. That's sitting over there. I'll tell you a little more about that. But these are the 3 sort of definitive histories of Olmsted County. There was a book called the Andreas Atlas of the state of Minnesota, which is also over there. I'll tell you a little more about that. And then there are a number of Rochester histories. 3 general histories of Rochester: Merle Rager, Harold Severson, and Harriet Hodgson. Each wrote a history of Rochester. They're all out of print. You can buy them online from used book dealers, but they're relatively rare and difficult to come by. Can I get a little water? And then there are a number of more recent books that have been written about various aspects of Rochester, mostly about buildings and about people in Rochester. The most recent, Amy Johans' Lost Rochester, right here, is for sale out here. It's a pretty good book about the buildings in Rochester that have come and gone. Alan Calavano's book is also a pretty good story. Thank you. Story about buildings in Rochester, but the last general history of Rochester itself was published more than 30 years ago, so one was due. Excuse me. And I'm not the only one who came up with the idea. There's a couple of books soon to be published that also cover these topics. Oops. So that's Histories of Rochester. Now, I'll just show you just briefly. Do you mind if I walk over here? This is the Andreas Atlas. It's a really cool book. It's rare as hen's teeth. I've seen it twice on eBay in the last 20 years. So it's very rare. The reason it's so rare is each page of book and map dealers tend to buy one of these books. They can sell one page. This page is the map of Rochester on one side and the map of Olmsted County on the other side. That typically sells for 25 to 50 bucks for that one page. And there are 300 some pages in the book. So they tend to be torn apart and sold as individual pages. So this book is exceedingly rare. I ask you for this particular book, if you want to look at it, you can look at this and turn the page with the post-it note. Look at that. Try not to handle it too much more. It's pretty old and fragile. This is the Joseph Leonard book, which was published in 1910, History of Olmsted County. That's a very helpful history. This is Helen Clape's book, The Doctor's Mail, which was published in 1941. This particular copy is autographed by Helen Clape's, so let's check out her autograph. Then I'll talk a little bit later about Barbara Woodward Lips, who left her estate to Mayo Clinic. It's an important contribution to Mayo Clinic, but there's a few of her jewelry that are depicted in here. For example, her sapphire pendant, it's life size. So take a look at those a little bit later. The other resources. This is Virginia Wright Peterson. It's coming out. Can you hear me?
Could you speak up just a little?
Try it. Virginia Wright Peterson has a new book coming out in March, the beginning of March, which is a general history of Rochester. I haven't seen it yet. She tells me there's a little overlap with my book and some things that are not covered in my book. There's no such thing as a complete history, but this will come out March 1st.
Paul, if you want to just hold them, I can find you. That might be
When
better.
I do that. Okay, so Histories of Mayo Clinic. The definitive history is by Helen Clapesaddle, published in 1941, 80 years ago. Bear in mind, there's actually two different versions. The original is 822 pages. There's an abridged version that's actually distributed by Mayo Clinic that's 400 some pages. So the abridged version is not too bad, but if you want to read the bulk of the history about W.W. Mayo, the father of the Mayo brothers, that's 250 pages in this book, and it's only 70 some pages in this book. So if you want the history of W.W. Mayo, read the unabridged version of The Doctor's Mayo and this book as well that's by Judith Hartzell, who's a descendant of the Mayos. Chuck Mayo's autobiography. Chuck Mayo is the son of Charlie Mayo, C.W. Mayo, as the son of Charlie Mayo. His autobiography is relatively uncommon. It's hard to find, but if you can get a copy on either from the library or from eBay, it's pretty interesting, humorous in some sense, a little more revealing about some of the inner workings of the Mayo Clinic. He had a few bones to pick with the Board of Governors that are kind of interesting to read about. And then probably the best single book about the Mayo Clinic is Clark Nelson's Mayo Roots. This also is out of print, but it's relatively easy to find on eBay. And if you want to read a single book about the Mayo Clinic, this is the one I would recommend. There are a few others that have come out in more recent years that are worth reading. Tony Bianco is a very distinguished author. He's also a native of Rochester, but he spent the bulk of his career as a senior writer for Business Week on Wall Street. He's published 5 previous books, and he's been working on a new definitive history of the Mayo Clinic for the last 4 or 5 years. And we're hoping that'll come out next year. So when that comes out, I highly recommend it. So my inspiration for writing this book was really my grandfather, Morris Scanlon. Morris lived in upstate New York most of his life. This is him. This is me when I was quite a bit younger. This is my father and my son Luke, who's now 42 years old. So this picture is about 40 years old. My grandfather Morris was born in upstate New York in 1890. His grandfather, James, immigrated from Ireland in 1850. And Morris grew up on the family farm and was a farmer by upbringing. Also was a trapper when he was a young man. And when he was a young man, he moved to Detroit, where he worked in a tire factory and was a professional boxer. And then he moved to Los Angeles, where he was a stevedore in the San Pedro Harbor. During World War I, he moved back to help his 60-year-old father run the family farm. And while he was doing that, he made a little extra money by selling hard cider and bathtub gin on the family farm. He always provided that free to the local cops and was never busted as a result. He was not bothered by them at all. And when Prohibition ended, he sold the family farm and moved into town and joined the police force. Served honorably for 35 years. His nickname as a police officer was Balls Scanlon. He also had a number of other passions. He kept fighting roosters for as long as I can remember, well into his 80s. He was busted for the last time in a cockfight in Pennsylvania when he was 85 years old. And tried to run from the cops, but he wasn't very fast at that point. But he always carried his police badge and his police IDs to help in circumstances like that. He was a fur dealer as a retired man. He bought furs from local trappers and sold them to the Hudson Bay Company. And he had a number of other things, but bottom line, he was a great storyteller. He had a lot of stories to tell. And family members always said we should write these down, and nobody ever did. So my grandfather's stories were lost to history. And so as I went into retirement, I thought these are some good stories. I don't want them to be lost to history. So I decided to write down my stories. So that was the genesis of the book. So when I retired, I started working a little bit on writing some of these ideas and some of these stories down. And it quickly became apparent that there was enough material there for a book. And so I thought, would anybody be interested in publishing this? So I inquired of the publisher that's published a number of the recent local histories of Rochester. It goes by two names, Arcadia Press in Charleston, South Carolina. They also go by the name The History Press. And when I inquired of them whether they'd be interested in publishing, they said, well, there's a book submission process we have. You just submit a proposal and we'll consider it. So I sent them a sample table of contents, a title, my biography, and a few sample chapters. And a couple of weeks later, relatively short time later, I got back their acceptance that yes, they would publish it if I wrote it. And so that started the process back in January of 2020. And needless to say, COVID came around not too long after that. So this gave me a project to work on while I was in lockdown with COVID. So we worked out the details, 50,000 word word limit, and about 120 illustrations were the specifications I was given. They assigned me an editor, and I actually got along great with my editor. He was very light in his handling and didn't give me a hard time at all. He agreed with just about everything that I wrote with relatively few minor suggestions. So the editing process was quite easy. And the first draft was submitted in July, and the final, after that full editing process and whatever modifications and additions and subtractions, the final draft was submitted in December, and that was published in June. So it's a pretty clean process. What's different about my book is it's not written like most history books. People love to hear stories. They like short stories. And yet most people don't like to read history books. Why is that? Most history books are big fat books that you take a long time to get through, and you may or may not get an answer to any particular question you have. But there's a lot of reading to do to get through it, most history books. So I wrote this as individual stories. It's 81 stories ranging from a short paragraph to 5, 6, 7 pages. They're all self-contained. You can read them in any order. In fact, I've been telling people lately, if you want to get into the book, the coolest story is the story of Henry Welcome. How many of you have heard of Henry Welcome? Sharon has, because I told her about him. Henry Welcome is the third greatest philanthropist of all time, all humanity, number 3, just behind Bill Gates. He came from Rochester, and nobody in Rochester has ever heard of the guy. It'd be like if Bill Gates was in your class in high school and you were thumbing through your high school yearbook and said, "Did you know Bill Gates was in our class? I forgot about the guy." That's basically what we're dealing with. I'll tell you more about Henry Welcome, but back to the point, read that story first just to get the sample. It's, I think, the coolest story in the book that you see for yourself. It can be read in any order. Pick a story, and I suspect eventually you'll give up with jumping around and just read through. But I suggest starting the book by just picking out a story or two and reading 1 or 2 stories at a time. So the question came up, what to include or exclude, and there's no such thing as a complete history. You can cover one story down to infinite detail, and any one of these stories could be a full-length book. So my choices were personal preference, cool factor, what's worth knowing, what's unique to Rochester. I tried to avoid duplication. I didn't want to do things that have been totally covered by other people. So there's certain things that I avoided. As I said, buildings have been pretty well covered by others, and they don't particularly interest me. So if you're fascinated to read the story of the downtown buildings, I can suggest other books that would probably cover that better than mine. Individuals, there's a number of individuals that I talk about, but if you read a book that's mostly biographies, they get to be much of a muchness, sort of repetitious stories of people's lives. They were born here, they died here, they did this, and so forth. So that gets to be repetitious, and so I don't concentrate on individual histories so much, although there are a number of individuals that are covered in there. And then another thing that's important in Rochester is balance. You can write about Rochester and you can get immersed in telling way too much about the Mayo Clinic. Not everybody wants to hear all about the Mayo Clinic. They want to hear some about the Mayo Clinic, but Mayo Clinic is the 800-pound gorilla in Rochester. Everybody has some sort of love-hate relationship with the Mayo Clinic, where some people despise the Mayo Clinic, some people love it, but everybody has to acknowledge it is the 800-pound gorilla in Rochester. And just by being where it is and what it is, it does some things that antagonize some of us some of the time, some people all the time, some people hardly ever. But when you're writing about Rochester, you have to kind of be aware of that. And just to illustrate that, why do people love the corn cob? It's unique, it's funky, it's graphic, it's iconic, but it's not Mayo. And I maintain that's an important part of the reason people love the corn cob.
We weren't able to do
Okay, so the book is organized in 3 sections. First, it's called Small Town Beginnings. It's the history of Rochester from the origins until 1883. The second section is called From Mess to Mecca. So it begins with the tornado in 1883 and ends in 1952 when the clinic was pretty well established. And the last section is in my lifetime. I was born in 1952, so it's what's within my personal recollection of my lifespan. So it's 3 roughly equal segments. When I initially proposed the book, I was kind of hoping that we would have the opportunity to publish a bunch of colored images, but turns out that most historical images are black and white, with the exception of stuff that's fairly recent. And so, for example, I selected the color illustrations that I would like to have had in color in the book. And this and this and this were originally black and white. They're colorized from black and white. And the rest are things that, they're cool, but they're not essential. This is mussel shells from the Zumbro River, and they're actually quite beautiful. There's 50 some species of freshwater mussels that grow in Minnesota rivers. And these are called, that's a giant floater. That's a pink heel splitter. This and this are called the black sandshell, and this is called an ellipse. And this is a beautiful golden color. These are 3 different shades of pink. They're really beautiful in person, and they're native to the Zumbro. All of these shells are collected from just downriver from Lake Zumbro. The Chateau Theater you're all familiar with. And this is a photograph by Dean Raker, which I love. And this is, as I mentioned, Barbara Woodward Lips, one of her many stunning jewelry. It's a necklace. This sapphire is 173 carats. It's 41 centimeters tall and 41 millimeters tall and 33 millimeters wide. It's huge. So that was part of her gift to Mayo Clinic. So what was left out? Is there room for more? People have asked me, are you going to write another book? I'm going to write some more stories. Some of these stories are great stories. Some are not so great stories. And I'm not sure if there's enough really great stories to justify another book, but there's certainly more stories to be told. So I started working on this, not really in earnest yet, but I've been thinking about organization, and I might write another book, but there's certainly plenty of good stories that haven't been told by me anyway. I've had lots of opportunities to make presentations. It's been fun talking about the book and hearing people's reflections on the book. It's been fun. So who's this Henry Welcome guy? Like I say, anybody, Sharon's heard of him, anybody else? Henry Welcome was born in Wisconsin. He grew up as a child in a town called Garden City, which is a tiny village near Mankato, but it was just on the edge of the Dakota War. In 1862, the Dakota War happened. It's been described as the most violent ethnic conflict in US history. There were over nearly 1,000 white settlers killed and an unknown number of Native Americans killed in these battles. There were battles up and down the Minnesota River Valley. I'll talk more about them in a bit, but Henry Welcome's 9th birthday occurred during that conflict. His 9th birthday occurred during that conflict. So he remembered seeing scenes of the evacuees leaving the area. So he grew up with a great deal of sympathy to both sides, who both the Native Americans and the white settlers suffered terribly as a result. When he was 17 years old, he moved to Rochester, and he took a job at Geisinger Drugstore, which was the drugstore over which W.W. Mayo had his medical offices. He worked as a pharmacy clerk in Geisinger Drugstore, and W.W. Mayo befriended him and mentored him. He saw him as a very intelligent young man. He taught him the sciences, and after a few years of teaching him and mentoring him, he said, you've got enough promise that I think you should go to pharmacy school and become a pharmacist. W.W. Mayo paid for him to go to pharmacy school, sent him to Chicago in 1871. The Chicago College of Pharmacy burned to the ground in the Great Chicago Fire that fall. So he came back to Rochester disappointed. He said, "We're not getting off that easy." He sent him to Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, from which he graduated in 1874. He worked for 6 years in the pharmacy industry, during which time in the United States, the technology for making medications in tablet form was perfected. but it wasn't yet distributed in England or the British Empire. So in 1880, with a friend named Silas Burroughs, he incorporated in London as Burroughs and Wellcome to market and distribute to the British Empire medications in tablet form. This quickly became the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. And 15 years later, in 1895, Silas Burroughs died unexpectedly, leaving Wellcome as the sole owner of the world's largest pharmaceutical company. For a lengthy and distinguished career, he led this company, developing many innovations, including insulin. They were a key developer in the methodology of distributing insulin, anti-inflammatory medications, tropical medicines for tropical diseases, and a number of other medications. So it remained the largest pharmaceutical company in the world throughout his life. And long after he died, it merged with a number of other companies. It is still one of the largest components of GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, which is still the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. He was enormously wealthy, and he left the bulk of his estate to what was named the Wellcome Trust. And the Wellcome Trust, to this day, is the third largest charitable trust in the world, fourth largest charitable trust in the world, valued at just over $40 billion. The annual proceeds from the Wellcome Trust is $600 million, which goes to charity and research. So his total gift to humanity is just under $70 billion, counting the current 40 billion plus all the spin-off that's been given to research and charity in the meantime. Total gift to humanity is 70 billion, making him the third greatest humanitarian of all time. Kind of getting ahead of myself. I'm having a hard time reading. Oh, yeah. So I read this up here. You can read it faster than I can read it. He remained good friends with W.W. Mayo throughout his life, and with Will and Charlie Mayo after W.W. Mayo died in 1911. In 1935, he had an extended stay in Rochester, being evaluated for the unexplained respiratory illness that ultimately killed him the next year. But during the time that he was evaluated for that, he gave an interview to the Rochester Post Bulletin, which said, I won't read the quote to you because I can't see it very well from here. But basically, he said, I owe it all to W.W. Mayo who gave me my start. So as I said, that's currently valued at just over $40 billion. Annual take is 600 million. Makes him the third largest philanthropist of all time. As I said, nobody from here remembers him for some reason. Can't read that. Yeah. So what if Bill Gates was your high school classmate and you forgot? Okay. Got a bunch of stories I can tell, but obviously you can get most of them from reading the book, but I'll go through a few things, just a few details, and then we'll do questions. The tornado that destroyed the north end of Rochester in 1883 killed about somewhere between 30 and 50 people. The account wasn't exact. The exact number was somewhere around 38, but there were a number of people who were unaccounted for, so there may have been up to 50 people. There was more than one tornado. There was a tornado the month before that destroyed Elgin and a few other towns, did a lot of damage, pretty much completely destroyed the town of Elgin. That was a month before this. And then August 21st, I believe, was the 3 tornadoes, including the one that destroyed the upper north end of Rochester. That fall, the 1883 History of Olmsted County was published just a few months later. And it included a fairly complete description. This is one of the most beautifully written descriptions of a disaster that I've ever heard, which I will read for you. A slight shower of rain passed over, and for a few moments succeeding, the air was as still as a tomb. Soon light fleecy clouds were seen scudding athwart the sky at lightning speed. The great dark mass in the west assumed a greenish cast. The heavens blazed with pale yellow lightning, and soon a roar was heard that caused stern faces to blanch and brave hearts to throb with terror. In a moment, the storm was upon us. With a roar like 10,000 demons, it swept down upon the beautiful city like a great coiling serpent, darting 1,000 tongues of lightning with a hiss like the seething, roaring Niagara. It wrapped the city in its hideous coils. The crashing of buildings and the despairing shriek of men, women, and children were drowned in this terrible roar. An hour later, the pale moonbeams fell upon 200 ruined homes, 2 score of dead, ghastly faces, and the stillness of night that was broken by the moans of the wounded and dying. What tongue or pen can half describe this terrible scene of desolation and death? Beautifully written. That's in the 1883 history of Ulster County. It was published just a few months after the storm. Probably there isn't sufficient time to do justice to the Indigenous people. We're standing on the land of the Indigenous people. The Dakota were the local tribe. In 1854, when Rochester was settled, there were a few places in Ulster County where the natives were regularly seen. Orinoco and Salem Township were 2 places where they were regularly seen. A group of about 200 natives camped out in what's now Silver Lake Park for the later part of the summer and early fall, and had an outbreak of either smallpox or some others illness like smallpox. There were 4 deaths among the people who were afflicted with this, and they moved their camp to out near Bamber Valley School, where Bamber Valley School is now for most of the rest of the winter. And in the late winter, they moved to the north end of town, where Cascade Mill is now. The remains of Cascade Mill, where Cascade Creek comes into the Zumbro below Silver Lake. There were a total of 6 people, 6 natives, who were buried in above ground graves on Indian Heights, the promontory overlooking what's now Silver Lake. Those graves were there until at least 1883, when they were presumably destroyed by the tornadoes sweeping over the hill. And there was no sign of the graves after 1883. Meanwhile, the Dakota War occurred in 1862, and the natives were a relatively small minority of them took part in the war. The Western Dakota and most of the Eastern Dakota actually objected to the proposal to wage war. So it was a relatively small minority of the Dakota who were engaged in the Dakota War. They were all expelled from the state of Minnesota as a result of the war to reservations in northeastern Nebraska and in the Dakota Territory. And there was what do you call it? They were, I'm blocking on the term, but they were not allowed back in the state of Minnesota until very recently. And so there's a lot of amends to be made. Of the white settlers, there were somewhere in the range of 500 or so who were killed in the slaughter that occurred. And 23 counties were evacuated, and most of the settlers never returned. So there was a huge exodus from the state of Minnesota as a result of this, and it took years for them to be repopulated. So this was a disaster of monumental proportions, and as I said, it's been described as the most violent ethnic conflict in U.S. history. So there's a lot more stories to be told about that. I'll finish up with just a few more slides. Another story that most people have never heard of was the Mayo Clinic's contribution to the war effort in World War II. The physiology group under the direction of Earl Wood, who's depicted here, he's also the guy sitting there, made 4 major contributions to the war effort, which basically gave them air superiority during World War II. The oxygen mask, BLB, is Bulbullion. Booth B. Lovelace and Bulbullion were the developers of the BLB mask. It was an oxygen mask which was provided to fighter pilots, allowing them to fly much higher than the Germans could fly. You can't go much above 10,000 feet breathing room air. You lose consciousness from lack of oxygen, but with oxygen mask providing them oxygen, they can fly up over 20,000 feet. So it gave them a huge advantage there. The second thing, which was perhaps even a greater advantage, the G suit. The high performance aircraft were developed around the time of the beginning of World War II that allowed fast enough turns and acceleration that as you pull G's, as fighter pilots talk about it, if you pull more than 7 times the force of gravity as you're going through a turn, you'll lose consciousness. And this began to occur with the development of some of the higher performance aircraft that came out during World War II. The Mayo Physiology Group developed the G suit. The G suit you should have undoubtedly heard of. That was developed here. And with the G suit, the fighter pilots were able to accelerate faster, turn harder, and fly circles around both German and Japanese planes that weren't capable of that because of the limitations of the pilots. The M1 maneuver is a grunting maneuver that pilots still use to this day. It's still called the M1 maneuver. The M is for Mayo. The M1 maneuver is a grunting maneuver that pilots do when they're pulling G's that helps them maintain consciousness. And it's still used to this day. And then the oxygen bailout bottle allowed pilots to bail out from altitude without losing consciousness. So these were 3 air superiority issues that were developed here at Mayo during World War II, before and during World War II. I'll finish with this. Louis Alvarez. Anybody heard of Louis Alvarez? Louis Alvarez is the only graduate of Rochester Public Schools that's won a Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1968, but he probably deserves several more. To briefly summarize, he graduated from Rochester Public Schools in 1928 and got his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1936. He spent a few years after that working in Chicago, studying early studies of tritium, which is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen, and a non-radioactive isotope of mercury that's still used to this day for measuring precise distances. He was then assigned to the MIT radar lab, where he invented ground control radar. It's still used to this day. It's critical to the safety of planes as they take off and land, having radar location of where's the runway relative to their wheels. He invented that, and it saved countless lives and aircraft during World War II, particularly during the Battle of Britain. While he was also at MIT, he developed the couple of other things that were important for telling friends and foes, but probably most impressively, the Eagle bomb sight. The Norden bomb sight was the standard bomb sight that bombers used in World War II. It was an optical sight that used optics to identify the target. That's fine when you got clear skies. When it's cloudy, you can't see a thing. And the Eagle bomb sight used the Eagle bomb sight used ultrasound to identify the target, and it was more accurate in zero visibility than the Norden bomb sight under clear sky conditions. So that came into play towards the end of World War II and was helpful in a number of their bombing missions. When he left MIT, he was assigned to the Manhattan Project, and he worked with Enrico Fermi in Chicago for a little while, working on where do you go? Oh, I got left out. he worked with Fermi in Chicago for a while, but then eventually he was assigned to Alamogordo, the Los Alamos project, where they were designing the nuclear weapons that were used over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He devised the implosion device for the plutonium bomb. The Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb were totally different. The Hiroshima bomb was a uranium bomb. Technically, it's a very simple bomb. You take two big chunks of uranium, slam them together, and they will explode. So technically, that's very simple. And they knew that the Hiroshima bomb would work. They never had to test that in advance. In fact, they didn't have enough uranium to make more than one bomb. The Japanese had the technology that when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, they would have known it was a uranium bomb. And they also undoubtedly guessed correctly that we didn't have enough uranium for a second bomb. They showed no sign of surrender. The second bomb dropped not too many days, like 6 days later on on Nagasaki. It was a plutonium bomb. Plutonium is much more readily available, and the device that allows the plutonium bomb, this implosion device, was the technical tour de force that made it possible. When the plutonium bomb was dropped, the Japanese would have also known it was a plutonium bomb, and we had developed the technology to drop a plutonium bomb. They would have likely guessed that there was more plutonium. Plutonium is much easier to come by, and they would have likely guessed that there was more plutonium bombs coming. In fact, there was one available to drop 8 days after the Nagasaki bomb. 6 days later, they surrendered, and it's really not known whether that was a decisive factor in their decision to surrender, but I think a reasonable argument can be made that really Alvarez won World War II for us. Subject to debate. So that was it. That was what he got his Nobel Prize for. After the war, he directed the Berkeley Particle Physics Lab, and in a series of experiments over the course of the next 2 decades, they described more than half of the known subatomic particles. And that was what he won his Nobel Prize for in physics. It was a solo Nobel Prize. It was to him alone, which is very unusual. It's usually to a group of people. But it was an acknowledgement of his work in the Berkeley Particle Physics Lab. And then, that wasn't enough. In 1980, with his son Walter, he wrote an article that was published in Science in 1980 that proposed what's subsequently called the Alvarez hypothesis, the idea that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid impact. It's named after him because he and his son thought of it. And it's subsequently essentially been proven that that's correct. So how many Nobel Prizes does that merit? And he's also a Rochester native. So why don't we? Oh, Barbara Williams. She was the greatest benefactor to Mayo at the time. Left her entire estate to Mayo. She grew up poor, married rich, but actually her husband died when she was fairly young, and she ran the business for 30 years on her own and multiplied his wealth by several orders. And when she died, she was a grateful Mayo patient, left all of her estate to the Mayo Clinic, 128 million, I think. And it included her jewelry and her decorative objects. And that sold for 7 or 8 million. This particular pendant sold for about $500,000. That's depicted in that book. One of my favorite stories. So with that, why don't we answer any questions?
Referencing Dr. Alvarez and his naming subatomic particles, do you know if he was also involved in identifying parts of quantum physics? Does that name associate with him? Because with subatomic particles, it gets into the quantum physics realm.
Yeah, subatomic particles move in funny ways. They're partly light, they have wave behavior like light, and particle behavior. And so when you're dealing with subatomic particles, particularly mesons that are the glue that hold the atom together, you have to understand some of the attributes of those particles. So I don't know if he was involved in the developing the quantum physics that goes behind explaining their movements and how they behave, but he certainly was instrumental in identifying those particles. The questions? For those of you that are interested, the book is for sale out in the lobby. They have several copies of it, and if anyone's got a copy, they want to sign up, happy to do so. Feel free to take a look at the books, and I'll be happy to answer any of the questions. There's a bunch of other stories that I have slides to describe it. If you have a question about it, Abby.
In reference to Dr. Alvarez and his hypothesis that you spoke about at the end, what led him to believe that dinosaurs were wiped out by an asteroid?
I can tell you more about that. His son is a geologist, geophysicist at Berkeley, Walter. And Walter, I think, was one of the key people that described what's called the KT boundary, the tertiary Cretaceous boundary. It's a layer between rocks in the earth. Let's see, I think the Cretaceous layer was the last phase of the dinosaurs, and that's where the dinosaur bones are deposited, and the tertiary layer is above that. And in the interface between the tertiary and the Cretaceous boundaries, there's an unusual amount of radioactive isotope called iridium. Iridium is very rare on Earth, but it occurs in stars and supernovas and comets. And his son came up with the idea, which they subsequently virtually proved. It's quite a bit of experimental data. They showed that the deposition of iridium in this tertiary Cretaceous boundary is way beyond what would be available from terrestrial sources and likely came from an asteroid. Subsequent to their original description in 1980, it's a very lengthy paper, which has a lot of data in it. It's pretty cool. But subsequent to the 1980 paper in Science, it's been demonstrated that the asteroid was thought to be, it's postulated to be about 10 kilometers or 6 miles in diameter. It struck at the Yucatan Peninsula. There's a meteor impact crater there. It struck the Yucatan Peninsula and had so much magma from the Earth, the molten center core of the Earth came up, squirting up into space and then slapping back down on the Earth. It set fire to most of the Earth, and there was a cloud of ashes that covered the Earth for a period of several years. And most life, including all of the dinosaurs, were killed off by that. Most large animals, small rodents survived by burrowing into the ground and managed to survive a few years of darkness, and eventually came back and repopulated the Earth and evolved to the mammals that we still know. There were a few birds that survived. Birds are descended from dinosaurs, so bird-like dinosaurs survived, but the large dinosaurs, the terrestrial dinosaurs, were killed off by the asteroid impact.
I would just like to tell a little story that I love. I did private duty at the charter house for about 8 years, from 1990 to 98. And I got friends to be with Amy Walters, who her dad was Dr. Will. The story that she loved to tell was when she was a little girl. This one Saturday morning, Dr. Will took her downtown, and they were standing in front of the 1913 building. Dr. Will says, "Phoebe, I hope this isn't a white elephant. And she looked up at him, he was real tall. And he said, she said, what is a white elephant? He says, it's something you don't know what to do with. You don't know what to feed it. It's an eyesore. And then when she'd tell that story, then she'd pause and she'd say, now look at it. This was like in the 90s.
Right, yeah, that's actually almost certainly a true story. He may have had feelings like that for the 1914 building, but there is a well-validated story that the night before the Plummer building was designed in 1926, leading up to 26, 24 to 26, and construction started in 1926. The night before they started the excavation for the foundation of the Plummer building, Will met with Henry Plummer, who was responsible for the planning process. And they talked a little bit about it. Will had some great misgivings, thinking that this project was too much, too big, too much financial risk. And so he told Henry that he wanted to meet him the next morning, next noon, after he finished his hospital rounds. So the following morning, Will went out to St. Mary's and did his hospital rounds and whatever procedures he needed to do. Came downtown at 9 o'clock or at noon. Meanwhile, the night before, Henry Plummer, we parted company with Will Mayo, called the contractor who was responsible for the construction project and told him, I want you to have as many excavation equipment available tomorrow and dig the biggest hole you can get in the ground as quickly as you can. Have the biggest possible hole in the ground by noon, which they did. And Will Mayo showed up at noon, looked at the hole in the ground, and said, go ahead, Henry. That's pretty well validated story. Sharon?
So my question is about intellectual property
Mhm.
in Mayo and
Yeah.
with all these talented people working there. There must have been an amazing number of inventions, innovations. Is it true that Mayo gave away almost all of the, good things that happened that they could have been taking money for, they just gave it to the world?
That's partly true, but partly myth. The question is, did Mayo give everything away? Particularly, it's asked with regard to the invention of cortisone. And the Upjohn was the company that commercialized and marketed the development of cortisone in collaboration with Dr. Kendall and Dr. Hench and their team, Dr. Slocum, Dr. Polly, the team of people are responsible for that. But in fact, there was quite a bit of royalties that came back to Mayo from Upjohn as a result of that. There was that they extract maximal benefit to Mayo from that? Probably not, but there was actually a lot of royalties that came back to Mayo from the development of cortisone. And as the time's gone on, the procedures for protecting and marketing intellectual property have been become more sophisticated and better developed. And Mayo's actually pretty good at both commercializing and marketing intellectual property now, and also is more generous with the scientists and people who develop the intellectual property. There's better royalties to the inventors nowadays than they used to have in the past. That was one of the objections that scientists had at Mayo in the past. Mayo was less generous with royalties than some other institutions. But nowadays, Mayo is pretty well on par with other academic medical institutions in royalties for intellectual property. Abby?
I had always heard that cortisone was developed in a garage in Rochester. Is there any truth to that? And if so, which garage?
Not true. It's not developed in Kendall's lab, which is in the sciences building.
Is he known for that? I thought Dr. Polly.
Dr. Kendall and Dr. Hench received the Nobel Prize in 1950 for the development and clinical use of cortisone. There was a third recipient named Thaddeus Richtenstein, who was Swiss, I believe, who also had some developments with cortisone. So the three of them received the Nobel Prize. There were 3 Nobel Prize medals awarded, one to each of them, 2 of which are on display in the 3rd floor of the Plummer building. And a lot of people thought Slocum and Polly were sort of cheated out of their acknowledgement. They were not acknowledged by the Nobel Committee, but Kendall and Hanshaw was acknowledged that Polly and Slocum were key members of the team. It wasn't just the 4 of them, but anything like that is a team effort. It's always difficult to decide, who gets the most acknowledgement. So Kendall and Hanshaw won the Nobel Prize, but Polly and Slocum were deserving of a lot of the recognition which they did receive. Other questions? Thank you all for listening. It's been fun. I'll stick around, and if you have further questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Feel free to take a look at the books. And if anybody's got a book that I'm going to send, I'll be happy to. Thank you.